Hello, good afternoon. We have just clicked live here on our webinar, our open newsroom about COP27. Obviously, with the nature of these things, and we're all very used to these kind of webinars now, I'm just going to give everyone a couple of minutes to get in and get settled and get their cups of tea, and then I'll introduce the panel. So yeah, maybe 60 seconds, and then I'll introduce the panel and just allow people to flood on in. Pun not intended there. Okay, welcome to everybody who's come in so far. I'm just giving people a few seconds to get in and get comfortable, and then we'll begin. Right. Thanks everyone for joining us. I just want to introduce our panel. Obviously, we're here to talk about COP27 as it comes to its conclusion, and we're delighted to be joined by two people from the heart of where everything is happening. Sive O'Neill is a lecturer and researcher in climate policy and climate ethics. She is a member of the DCU Centre for Climate and Society and has worked with numerous environmental campaigning organisations and was formerly a Green Party councillor on Dublin City Council and a policy advisor on the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate Action. She is calling in from the COP27 conference in Sharm el-Sheikh, and obviously there may be a couple of technical issues which I think Sive may be experiencing right now. So I'll move on and introduce Niels Malema, who works in the Netherlands, where he is policy advisor on climate justice for Action Aid, an organisation that works with communities facing structural poverty and injustice. He has several years' experience in the areas of climate policy and human rights, and has been closely monitoring the negotiations at COP on issues like loss and damage, which we will talk about momentarily. But first, Niels, can you give us an update about what's happening today? As I said, the conference is coming to a close, and we're hoping to get a deal. What's on the table at the moment?
So for the past couple of days, it's looked like we've been at an impasse. But the EU last night made a proposal on the loss and damage funding facility, which I'm happy to explain more about what that means. But really what that means at this stage is that there is finally an actual negotiation happening and the ball has gotten rolling. I am told that the presidency wants to round everything off by lunchtime tomorrow, which is a welcome sight after 2 weeks of strenuous negotiations and conversations.
So with that update, Sive, what are your overriding feelings about COP27, negative or positive? Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future, given your 2 weeks there?
I think it's important to note that coming into this COP, we've had decades of failing to mitigate, which has led us to a need to adapt to climate change, which has now, a failure to adapt has now left communities on the front lines confronted by climate change and climate catastrophe on a daily basis, which is why loss and damage is on the agenda now. Loss and damage being the loss of livelihoods, the loss of lives from these climate impacts like hurricanes, like the floods in Pakistan and other places. So my feeling about COP as a whole will be wholly determined by whether or not we walk out of here with a funding facility that addresses those needs of those communities. And I am hopeful that we get there, but it's still not decided that that's the case.
And looks like we've momentarily lost Sive. Hopefully we'll get her back shortly. Lauren, same question to you. What are your overriding feelings about COP now that it's coming to an end?
Yeah, you know what, I was thinking about this recently, and I was remembering how last year coming up to COP26, because that was sort of, there was a lot of anticipation around that. There'd been a gap where, you know, we didn't have a COP because of COVID. So coming into COP26, there was, I think, very much a sense of cautious optimism was the word we were all using. And that was kind of dashed then by the end of COP26. So now this year coming into COP27, I think there was a lot more feelings of maybe skepticism, kind of hesitancy of what this is going to bring. And unfortunately, I don't think it has delivered in a way to alleviate those kind of concerns that people came in with at the start, particularly now as we're looking at the kind of loss and damage funding. regardless of what kind of decision is made on it now, if a deal is reached, we're still looking a couple of years down the line before the implications of whatever is agreed are actually coming into play, which with an issue as urgent as climate change is always going to be disappointing when they seem to keep getting pushed further and further out.
So I have the same question to you. Are you more pessimistic or more optimistic after your 2 weeks in Egypt?
It's hard to say. Firstly, apologies for dropping off there. This is just one of the many incidences where the Wi-Fi is down, and I came into the media center to get the best possible version of it. It's been a frustrating COP in many respects. We've been here waiting for breakthroughs for nearly 2 weeks. The patchy sort of little bits of text that were coming through from the presidency showed a lack of ambition from almost everybody. You know, a lack of determined effort to get stuck into the negotiations proper. But what happens, mentioning in relation to the EU initiative, although it's not entirely an EU initiative, it's important to put it in context. And this was a reaction to that. But it was a very deft diplomatic maneuver by the EU to build a new type of alliance around a set of proposals that it could live with. So I feel a lot more hopeful, just to get to your question, than I did 2 days ago. A couple of days ago, you know, I thought this COP was going to be an unmitigated disaster. It didn't look like we were going to have language that was even as strong as that came out of Glasgow. And the idea at this point in the climate crisis of going backwards instead of forwards from Glasgow was just unthinkable. So a lot remains to be seen in terms of the conclusions of the negotiations around mitigation, loss and damage, adaptation. You know, there's a package, there's a mosaic of issues that all have to be covered in the final decision. But I think some significant breakthrough has been made, and it really needs to be acknowledged.
Yeah, so even in 24 hours, things can change. So hopefully by this time, at lunchtime tomorrow, which Niels was saying, you know, is when there's hopefully an agreement, which again would be a change. Sometimes these things go on till the Monday. So Niels, you mentioned that you can explain loss and damage, and you've kind of given an outline of why it's so important, but also why is it so controversial? For a lot of people listening, maybe the people who are on the call or looking back later will think, well, obviously people who are causing the most damage should pay for it. It's like basically how like our insurance system is built. So can you explain why it's so controversial?
I mean, it starts with the fact that the countries who are hit hardest and the communities who are hit hardest by climate change are also the ones who have contributed the least to it. And that baseline, I think, is something that the general public understands at a very good level. But governments are very hesitant to deal with it. There are questions of liability that they are trying to avoid. It is very clear that most of the EU countries and the US, and together with them, the global north as a whole, does not want to have any language that reflects them being responsible for the crisis. We saw this in the actual negotiations as to whether or not loss and damage would be on the agenda. That they said it would only be on the agenda if we take the issue of liability out of this. And that in itself tells you a lot about where they are and where they stand. There is a reluctance to take responsibility for the damage that they have caused. With that, they are also then putting the costs of their actions on the communities, the people on the front lines, and saying essentially sort it out yourself. So it's a big step that it was on the agenda, but there is still a whole long way to go, even with this proposal, because there are some very alarming pitfalls that fit within that proposal that the EU has put forward.
So I made a insurance analogy there, but it does sound like a medical negligence case. You know, we will settle for damages, but we're not taking any liability. Do we know what amounts we're talking about here, Saif? Like the deal that's on the table, how many hundreds of millions, billions are we talking?
To me, or sorry?
Well, there aren't.
Go ahead, Saif.
There aren't specific amounts of money on the table. We haven't got to that point yet. But just to put it in context, the flooding in Pakistan earlier this year is reckoned to have cost in the region of $30 billion worth of. But it's important to note that developing countries, especially the most vulnerable states, are not just looking for compensation for economic losses. They're looking for what they call non-economic losses. In other words, you can't really put a value on the price of lives. You can't put a value on the idea of people that are displaced from their homes, who lose their ancestral lands, the cultural heritage that's lost, and you know, there are entire island populations that might need to migrate. So that is a kind of non-economic loss. It's an irrecoverable loss. So the idea is that you can't limit the mechanism to just what can be measured in terms of, you know, damage and destruction to property. It's much bigger than that. However, it's important to note that that made its way into one of the proposals. I can't remember if it made its way into all three options, but it's going to be very difficult to operationalize that principle. The way that these financing mechanisms work, they are very good at financing. This is true of the multilateral finance mechanisms as well, financing assets, infrastructure, and things like that. They're very bad at financing the sort of more nuanced, local, community-based types of adaptation and responses that actually work the best, because it's just really hard to figure out how to get that money directly into the communities that need it. But just to say that there's no money as such committed yet. Nothing has been committed. We're just talking about general principles and putting a shape on. It won't even be one mechanism. It'll be hopefully a mechanism, firstly under the UNFCCC. That's really important for a number of reasons, because of the principles enshrined in the Framework Convention around common but differentiated responsibilities. But also the mechanism could cover or touch on existing mechanisms like the Green Climate Fund, the Green Shield, which is a kind of insurance mechanism, and also other financial mechanisms that are not currently under the climate regime, but could be very instrumental for supporting vulnerable states.
It strikes me, actually, if I could add there, when we hear about the kind of the scale of destruction that's being caused and the level of support that's needed, both in the financial and the non-financial sense, it puts it into context for me when you hear these announcements that Ireland comes out with around the line that we've already committed. Eamon Ryan this week announcing 18 million funding from Ireland, and that then broken down into smaller amounts of kind of 1 million to this fund, 1 million to that fund, 10 million to another, and the remainder somewhere else. It puts that picture on it of how small a drop in the ocean that amount really is. Obviously, Ireland is a small country, and we can't. Nobody's saying Ireland is going to be the one to do it all. But just I suppose the level of commitment that is really needed from everywhere, and just that picture of, you know, and I think as well, actually, just on the 80 million, knowing that all of those little amounts as well are kind of just adding up to this larger 225 million. That's the figure that Ireland has committed over kind of the next few years. It just strikes me when we're talking about the overall picture of the scale of what's needed, and then you look at how the kind of, you know, the cookie is crumbled into really such small portions.
Yeah, just for those who are attending right now, if you have any questions for our panelists, feel free to drop them into the Q&A, and we will try to get to them by the end of our conversation. The Q&A box is open for everybody there, and I have a couple of questions that were emailed into us, so we'll try and get to them as well. Niels, Lauren mentioned timelines there at the start, and again, is there any timelines in terms of the loss and damage agreement? Like, if there is, like Simon said, there's not even amounts on the table yet. So when is the outcome of this even going to be felt?
So it was agreed that this agenda would be on the table, and that they need to agree on that they need to come with an outcome no later than 2024. They're allowed to agree early. What we are aiming for and what we are hoping to see come out of this COP is a local agreement that there will be a funding facility, and the creation of some kind of working group or task force or transitional team that will then develop and lead the negotiations on how that funding facility will actually look, and what other mechanisms are also necessary to properly address this scale of loss and damage that that has very clearly been etched, right? Because a fund in itself is not going to cover everything, and it is not expected to cover everything. It is there so that we can reach the most vulnerable people, and it is there to fill a gap that exists in current measures that are there. And I do want to add to the fact that the EU proposal that exists at this stage does not meet some of those requirements. It undermines the principles of common but differentiated responsibility that were mentioned before, which essentially means look at the historical emissions of a country and look at a country's ability to pay. The EU has said we would like to broaden the contributor base to such a fund, thereby essentially saying we would like to renegotiate previous agreements, undermining previous agreements. They would like to make sure that this fund is only accessible to the most vulnerable countries and not the most vulnerable communities. I think that's a very clear distinction that needs to be made, because a country like Pakistan is very likely to not fall within the definition of a very vulnerable country. When we've spoken to the EU, they have consistently said, we are talking about small island states and least developed countries. And there are a great number of communities in middle income countries that are not going to be able to access loss and damage finance, even though they have contributed very little to the problem. And that means that they will not be able to recover their homes, their livelihoods, their livestock, and their farms. And the final thing that we have issue with within the EU proposal is that they have made it conditional to stepping up mitigation strategies without mentioning any of the baseline principles of equity, looking back at who's historically responsible for their emissions and how to address that. And there's also no comment on how to support countries in aligning themselves with 1.5 degrees of warming, of a maximum of 1.5 degrees of warming. So these are the issues that are still going to have to be ironed out before moving forward, because they are red lines for a number of countries here and a number of communities that we work with.
Yeah, so we go from the loss and damage to what's causing the loss and damage, which, as you said, is the warming, the emissions. So the other big ticket item really on the agenda is our use of fossil fuels. So a draft decision published yesterday failed to call for a phase out of all fossil fuels, which is something that has obviously been on the table. Lauren, can you remind us what happened last year at COP26? Because this was the big kind of wish and hope for Glasgow, was we would have a deal that would say we will phase out fossil fuels.
It was, and at the start of Glasgow last year, there were some kind of positive signals. It was on the agenda in a way it had never been before, and that was seen as kind of a great sign. But what we saw then throughout the 2 weeks, particularly in the last few days of COP26, was this kind of progressive watering down of that initial commitment throughout these drafts, and a lot of tinkering with the language. Do you call it phasing out or phasing down, or are you urging countries, or are you requiring them to do something? And that's all kind of similar arguments that are happening this year now around the text on loss and on damage and on fossil fuels. So Glasgow ended without that kind of firm commitment that was initially hoped for at the start. And again, further consideration being given to that now this year. I found really interesting kind of the parallels a little bit between what happened last year with fossil fuels and maybe this year what's going on with loss and damage, because the way that fossil fuels came onto the agenda last time in a way it hadn't been before. Sort of similar here with loss and damage. We had loss damage on this agenda, where it hadn't really appeared before. And again, that kind of initial hope. But even from the very start with the loss and damage, there was this kind of tempering down with these stipulations that were attached to the agenda. And we've seen now how the contention around it and the debate between countries has played out. And there are positive signals, as we've kind of touched on with the loss and damage, but still a lot to be worked out. And it was very similar last year with the fossil fuels. So that now too is really on the table this year.
Sive, what are you expecting from the fossil fuels deal?
Sorry, it's really hard to say at the moment how that's going to play out. There has been a very significant push, partly from civil society, fantastic campaign spearheaded to try to push for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. They were visible on the sidelines of COP26, but they are everywhere here, and they are really very, very effective in their campaigning. So the idea there is to create some sort of legally binding mechanism to phase out fossil fuels over time and to stagger it so that pretty much along the lines of the Montreal Protocol on banning CFCs, there would be supports and finance available to developing countries. Because I just wanted to kind of pick up on one thing that Neil said, which I think we have to acknowledge that are not willing and to aligning their NDCs with 1.5 degrees of warming. And I'm not talking about the poorest countries. I'm talking about specific countries that have fossil resources that they. So there's a real dilemma here, sort of political solution to provide those countries with an adequate incentive to leave the fossil fuels in the ground, and at the same time some kind of a stick mechanism, carrot and stick, and the stick part is some kind of legally binding treaty. Now the campaign have not specified the language. They're very clever to leave it to the parties to work on that themselves, because there is a Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance that was established in Glasgow. The hope was that it would, really snowball this year and a lot of big states would come in and back it. Unfortunately, a couple of not big states came on board, but no really big players. I mean, not every country has fossil resources, so it's easy for Ireland, it's easy for Chile perhaps to sign up to something like this, but you really want to get a state, that has fossil resources to commit to ending their use and exploitation. And there wasn't much movement on that. However, I would be surprised. The way these international negotiations work, it takes a few years for something to really start gaining momentum. So I would suspect that, especially going to another Arab state with fossil resources next year, that there'll be a determined effort to get that onto the agenda in some shape or form and to build up that beyond oil and gas. But in terms of the language, it's significant that India was happy to broaden the language beyond just coal, because they don't really use any gas. And they were a significant block, or they were blocking the kind of language that Lauren was describing, the more ambitious language at COP26, and as was China. So I think it's always very difficult to get good language on fossil fuels. It's ridiculous. I mean, the world knows, we know the problem, we know the source of it. But in the context of these international politics, when you have those big giant petrostates with a veto effectively over everything, they're basically holding the planet to ransom as far as I'm concerned. It's very, very difficult to get agreement on strong language about phasing out fossil fuels. They're going to hold out to the bitter end. And it does point to the need for some sort of procedural institutional reforms in the UNFCCC processes, that we can bypass those countries that are blocking progress. And, the earth is on fire and they're not even willing to put it out.
In a related question, aside from
extraordinary.
In a related question from one of our audience, Michael Walker asks for the panelists' view on the reported 600 fossil fuel lobbyists being allowed to attend COP, and should they be allowed at future COP events?
Can I say something about that quickly, actually, because one thing that concerns me is that there were some industry representatives on the Irish overflow delegation. Now, that's very much in the gift of the Department of Climate Action to decide who goes on the delegation. And usually the places are reserved for academics and civil society, and it's always been like that. I've been on the overflow delegation for a countless number of years. This is the first time that I've seen industry representatives choosing to go for an overflow badge rather than observer badges. And we saw very significant industry players attending meetings that were usually reserved for civil society. So it goes both ways. This kind of lobbying is happening at a domestic level unless we stand up and speak out and make rules to prevent it, because these industries have enormous amounts of money to gain and at stake in all of these policy processes. They are everywhere at COP. It's all about money. It's all about carbon offsets and carbon accounting and all these firms, these intermediaries and consultancies. So it's not even just about fossil fuels. It's the way that industry gets the ear of government far too easily. And I'm very concerned about that. In fact, I wrote to the minister about it because I was very cross that those two particular individuals were allowed to attend civil society meetings. They're not civil society. Under what definition are they civil society? Industry in all these stakeholder definitions at UN level and across all the different UN bodies are a very separate block stakeholder.
It's really interesting to get that insight from the ground. And Lauren, we did want to ask you about Irish ministers at COP and get your insights of what they had been doing. So we did have a delegation of 4 Irish ministers, which is, quite a lot of, I guess, heavyweights of Irish politics. They're not heavyweights over there, but here they are to go over. What was your take on what they were doing and where they sat in the place of COP27?
Yeah, you're right. And actually, Eamon Ryan has become a little bit more of a heavyweight now that he's kind of taking on a leading role in the negotiations, which is really interesting to watch from the Irish perspective. But I guess going back to the very start, so the Taoiseach was the first to come over. He was there for the Monday and Tuesday for the World Leaders Summit. So he was there kind of having some meetings. I suppose the big ticket item of his trip is the speech he delivered at the World Leaders Summit. It was about, I suppose, what you would expect from a speech from him. It was, roughly similar to the type of language he used last year. He talked about the need to act now to kind of to save the future. I mean, you could kind of fill in the blanks, really. Then he was followed by Minister for Foreign Affairs Simon Coveney. So he had some bilateral meetings with the leaders from Somalia, from the Cook Islands. He also met actually with Egypt's Foreign Affairs Minister, who's the COP27 president. And he obviously, being Foreign Affairs, has particular interest in kind of the climate, links with things like security, both in terms of conflict, but also in relation to things like food. And then his junior minister from the Department of Foreign Affairs, Colin Brophy, who's responsible for overseas development aid, was there after him for 2 days. And he had quite an interesting agenda, but also he spoke quite strongly about really the need for leaders to speak, to get their act together, because he earlier this year had traveled to northern Kenya, where there's been such devastation with droughts and people, people's lives really on the line. And he actually spoke quite strongly about that and about the way that has shaped his perspective on climate issues. And he said that he felt the spirit of the Paris Agreement is nearly dead and buried unless we really ramp things up. That was the language he used, which kind of stuck out to me as being as going maybe a step beyond what you normally hear from politicians, which is kind of these overarching kind of platitudes, I guess, if you could call it that, being thrown out, but sometimes failing to kind of really nail it down where the issue is. So those were the 3 for the first week, and then we have Eamon Ryan over there now this week. So he's been there since Monday, I think it was. Again, various different meetings with leaders in other countries and kind of different alliances. But particularly now, what's interesting about his trip is that he has been made the EU's main man on the loss and damage negotiations. And he spoke to media on Wednesday, and was saying how now from that point on he was kind of speaking for the EU really, as opposed to speaking for Ireland. And I think you sort of felt a shift as well in his language right away. So say, for example, the proposal that was made by the G77 and China on what they wanted to see on loss and damage, Eamon Ryan then was, okay, we looked at that, we liked some parts of it, we didn't like other parts of it, we're going to go back and, more very much kind of, very cautious about channeling the EU's sort of official position, kind of, walking that line of where they're coming at it from. And he was speaking to Irish media over there again this morning on, what his thoughts are around when is this going to wrap up, and will it come out with a deal? And his language was kind of saying, please God, it will come out with a deal, but that he kind of didn't anticipate necessarily going home this evening. So it's been a busy 2 weeks for the Irish ministers over there, and it's interesting to watch them. I think particularly now with Eamon Ryan having that role in the EU.
And Niels, what's your take on Eamon Ryan getting that gig, given that he's the leader of the Green Party here?
Yeah, I think initially we were quite hopeful about the fact that the Irish in general took the lead on loss and damage. We know Ireland as a good contributor to multilateralism. We know them as a country that they are not exactly living up to their fair share on climate finance. They are scaling it up. They still need to scale that up further, but they've shown that with the climate finance that they're mobilizing, they know how to reach the most vulnerable. They know how they seem to know what the problem is and where some of the solutions lie. And I would like to appeal to him to live up to that standard in these negotiations on loss and damage, because it genuinely is a matter of life and death when we're talking about this fund. And so far, the EU has been slow to move. They have now moved a little bit further, but we cannot have this strand because of issues on equity, because of issues on access for the most vulnerable communities. These are things that Ireland is very strong on. And we really need them to make sure that that tone is set within the EU delegation and to be able to stand for those communities that are now being hit the hardest.
Yes, so I've a lot of people they'll hear this conversation about what Ireland can do and what Irish government should do, and they'll say, yeah, well, what's the point because China, or what's the point because Russia? What would you say to that? Oh, I think you're muted there.
Yeah, this question comes up all the time,
Yeah.
that are insignificant emissions and so on and so forth. And, the reality is that if everybody in the world consumed, carbon and fossil fuels like Ireland, we'd need 3 or 4 planets. So you can look at a fair share in terms of your capita emissions, which in Ireland's case are among the highest in the EU. I think we're 2nd or 3rd highest after Luxembourg and somewhere else. Or, you can look at our historical contribution to the problem and basically work out, as Niels was describing, a kind of an equitable, fair share of the contribution to the problem and thus the ability to pay. The reality is, as a member of the European Union, we're bound by European Union agreements as well. So it's not just what we feel like doing at the UN. We go into these negotiations as part of 27 member states that collectively agree on target, which has now been increased to 57% emission reductions by 2030, bearing in mind that Ireland's own legislative, legally binding commitment at home is 51, and we're not on track at all to meeting that. So the reality is that we have an awful lot of work to do to live up to the commitments we made when we signed up to the Paris Agreement Framework Convention back in 1992. The emissions down below their 1990 levels. But that we haven't managed to do that yet. So we're failing badly, and we're failing those communities in the sense of we made a promise and we're not living up to it. And the whole sort of delicate, sort of structure, the architecture of this international framework convention on climate change and all the other protocols and Paris Agreement that go with it is based on reciprocity. Is that, I'll step up if you step up, and you step up and then I'll step up. And that's how it works. And that's why this last minute bargaining, cooperating and compromising. The reality is that climate politics at a domestic level is always very challenging. In some countries, less so perhaps than in Ireland, but we can see there are major blockages. I met with the Taoiseach while he was here, and myself and Professor Hannah Daly impressed upon within first carbon budget for 2025, and that much bolder measures were going to be required. And the Taoiseach pushed back. He kind of said, well, we have to bring people with us, and we can't frighten people by saying that this is an emergency that's going to continue forever and ever. And we kind of said to him, but it is an emergency, and we have to start thinking of it like that. We have some experience of stepping in an emergency and using our state resources did in COVID.
Just give us a quick timeline of what you're expecting over the next 12 to 24 hours and who we should be watching for.
As to how the negotiations are going, where they stand, where new proposals are coming from. So to on those, always keep an eye on the heads of delegations that are here. Keep an eye on Frans Timmermans. Keep an eye on the heads of delegations from the US and China. I mean, at this stage, the EU has taken a step. There is a response that we expect to come from the G77 in China. There is a response that we expect to come from the US. Where we go in the negotiations hinges on how they respond on this, and then we'll see from there. I mean, there's a scenario where we finish this at lunchtime tomorrow. There's also a scenario that when I get on the plane on Monday, we're still not out of this, and it's incredibly difficult. And I will say this: that every time you look at a COP and every time you look at an international negotiation, until we have found an agreement, it is very difficult to see how we come to an agreement. But I do want to leave with one extra comment, and that is on the fossil fuels. It is shocking to me that we are having a discussion about loss and damage, and we are 30 years down the line of these negotiations. The science is absurdly clear about the fact that there is no space for oil, gas, and coal initiatives. And yet, it's not only the Gulf states and other places that are blocking this, it is also the EU that is making deals for extra gas on the sidelines of this COP. There is a push from a lot of these high emitting countries to not step on the mitigation side. And the fact that that is something we can't agree on is utterly baffling.
Yeah, Lauren, I just wanted to ask you about your reporting experience from COP. You're not there right now, but you were there for the first week. Was there a sense of that, like with everything going on in Europe, with the talk at home about energy and the need for liquefied gas and all of that? Was it an unusual place to be reporting from?
It is. I mean, I think on that side, in terms of, you know, the kind of the energy crisis in Europe, what struck me as really interesting was that leaders were quite quick in their speeches to kind of gesture towards geopolitical situations, but they were much slower to actually name Russia as the problem there. And that maybe plays in a little bit to, you know, what you're talking about around those kind of side deals around the EU and other countries still looking at gas and at other fossil fuels. In terms of reporting, it is a very strange place to be as a journalist. I was there in the media centre that Sive is in now, and even logistically, it's strange because, you know, the media centre is on one side of the campus and then the press conference rooms are on the other, and, you know, the negotiating space is somewhere else as well. And part of that is the nature of it being such a big area, but it's very interesting though to be there as a journalist as well, because there's so much going on. There are so many people to speak to, so many things to look at, and you know, kind of you have all these potential stories, I guess, unfolding out in front of you, and trying to decide with the time that you have, you know, who are you going to talk to and what are you going to see, and, you know, some of that you can kind of plan in advance, but then other parts are, you know, you kind of stumble across something, and that's kind of, you know, part of the power of maybe having such a big event. But there are drawbacks to that too. Like, I was talking to a lot of people, particularly from developing countries, you know, and this kind of the sense of all of this that's going on around the edges in terms of like countries and, you know, businesses maybe having their pavilion set up in the blue zone and also in the green zone. All of these things that are happening around the edges and maybe detracting attention away from the core of the negotiations, that it does seem, you know, excessive or even like a waste of resources itself. There's the other side of the argument then, which is that it's really important to get people together, like campaigners and experts and academics, that it's really important as a space for getting those people together and, you know, having them there to hold the negotiators to account and to, you know, also be able to, I guess, communicate with each other on these issues. So it's, you know, the question kind of comes up of like, is the structure of COP, the way we do it now, the best way to have these kind of talks? And it's so hard to say because everybody has a different perspective on it, on, you know, whether or not there's value to having it as this big, massive event or whether it should be stripped back down. So definitely as a journalist, it's a very unique experience being over there.
And just finally, before we wrap, if you can let people know how to follow your coverage over the next few days and weeks and months and obviously years, because this isn't getting sorted anytime soon.
Yeah, so obviously on the journal.ie, you'll find all our articles about COP and climate change in general. And we also have our newsletter Temperature Check, which ordinarily we send out every month. And we were also sending special editions over the last 2 weeks for COP27. But normally it'd be every month. So we kind of look at a particular climate issue in depth in each edition, and also give kind of quick overview of what else is big going on in climate that month. So those are kind of the key ways. And you know, I tweet as well at Lauren Anna _1 for the time being. We'll see what happens with Twitter. But and the journal.ie, Twitter and Instagram as well. Obviously we've lots of things everywhere.
Great, thanks, Lauren. And talking about other big news events as well as Twitter, the FIFA World Cup is starting in Qatar this weekend, and Lauren has taken a look at the claim that it will be a net zero World Cup. I don't think it would be a surprise to anyone that there's a huge amount of untruth in that, and Lauren will have a piece on the weekend on the Journal dismantling that claim and what's actually going on in Qatar at the moment. Sive, Niels, thank you so much for your expertise and your time. It's been really interesting to see you guys in COP and to get your views from the ground. Best of luck with the next 24 hours. And I'm sure we'll talk to you again soon. Thank you so much for everyone who has attended and watched back across the site and on YouTube. Thank you very much.